Most people don't realize this, but the version of Nietzsche they carry in their head is already distorted. It's not the philosopher himself. It's a simplified idea that has been repeated so many times it starts to feel true. Strength, independence, rising above others, not needing anyone. It sounds powerful, almost addictive in the way it promises control over your life. And in a world where people feel uncertain, that promise hits hard. The idea that you can become someone untouched by weakness, someone who stands alone and doesn't bend, feels like the answer to everything. But that is also where the problem begins, because what sounds like strength on the surface slowly changes the way you relate to everything underneath. You stop noticing it at first. It doesn't feel like something is being lost. It feels like something is being built. You become more controlled, less reactive, less dependent on what others think. You start handling things on your own, solving your own problems, carrying your own weight. And all that looks like growth. In many ways, it is growth. That's what makes this so convincing. The issue is not that Nietzsche was pointing at something false. He saw something very real about human beings. He saw how easily people fall into patterns, how they follow values they never questioned, how they depend on approval without even realizing it. Most people are shaped by their environment far more than they think, and they defend that shape as if it were their own choice. Nietzsche's frustration with that was not shallow. It came from a deep understanding of how passive people can become in their own lives. But then he pushes further, and this is where things start to tilt. He begins to treat dependence itself as something to overcome. Not just blind obedience, but the need for others in general. The more you absorb that idea, the more subtle shifts begin to happen in the way you see connection. Needing people starts to feel like a flaw. Wanting support starts to feel like weakness. Even emotional openness begins to look like something you should outgrow. And none of this happens in an obvious way. It happens quietly, through interpretation, through the way these ideas settle into your thinking over time. You start choosing distance without calling it distance. You tell yourself you're becoming self-sufficient. You stop sharing certain things because you believe you should be able to handle them alone. You hold your emotions tighter, not because you can't express them, but because you think you shouldn't need to. And slowly, without any dramatic moment, your world becomes smaller in a very specific way. What makes this dangerous is that it still feels like strength. You are less affected by others. You rely on yourself more. You don't get pulled into unnecessary drama. From the outside, it looks like clarity. From the inside, it feels like control. But control is not the same as wholeness. And that difference is easy to miss when everything still appears to be working. Humans are not just thinking beings trying to optimize themselves. They are relational. The way you understand yourself is deeply tied to how you connect with others. Not in a weak or dependent sense, but in a fundamental sense. You don't fully see yourself in isolation. You see yourself reflected, challenged, understood, misunderstood, and reshaped through interaction. When you reduce that interaction in the name of strength, you don't just remove noise. You remove part of the process that makes you who you are. Nietzsche understood the danger of conformity, but he underestimated the cost of separation. And that cost does not show up immediately. It builds slowly in the background of your life. A slight distance in conversations, a hesitation to open up, a habit of dealing with things alone even when you don't have to. None of these feel like major decisions, but together they create a pattern. And that pattern changes how you experience everything. It becomes harder to feel fully connected, even when you are around people. Not because they are lacking something, but because you have trained yourself to stay slightly apart. You observe more than you engage. You analyze more than you share. You protect your independence so carefully that you don't notice what it is costing you. This is where the idea starts to quietly work against you. Because strength, when it is built by cutting off parts of yourself, is not complete strength. It is selective. It favors control over openness, self-reliance over connection, distance over vulnerability. And while that can make you more stable in certain ways, it can also make your life feel less alive in ways that are harder to define. Nietzsche was trying to push people out of passive living. That part matters. But in doing so, he created a direction that, when followed too strictly, leads people into a different kind of imbalance. Not one of weakness, but one of disconnection. And the hardest part about that kind of problem is that it doesn't look like a problem at all. It looks like you've finally figured things out. And this is where the idea becomes uncomfortable in a different way. Because once you see that shift, you can't really go back to seeing it as pure strength anymore. It starts to feel incomplete. Not wrong in the sense that everything should be rejected, but wrong in the way it quietly pushes you away from something essential without ever admitting it. Because if you look closely, the version of strength most people take from Nietzsche is built on a kind of narrowing. It tells you to cut away dependence, cut away softness, cut away anything that makes you feel exposed. And for a while, that feels like refinement, like you are removing what is unnecessary. But human beings are not something you can refine endlessly without losing something important. At some point, what you call unnecessary is actually part of what makes life feel real. The problem is that control is easier to measure than connection. You can feel when you are in control. You can see it in your behavior, your discipline, your independence. It gives you a clear sense of progress. But connection is quieter. It doesn't always feel like achievement. It feels like presence, like openness, like letting yourself be affected by something outside of your control. And if you've trained yourself to avoid that, even slightly, you start to move through life in a more closed way without realizing it. This is where the idea of becoming stronger starts to overlap with something else entirely. It starts to look like emotional restriction, not because you can't feel, but because you've decided somewhere along the way that certain ways of feeling are beneath you. That needing reassurance is something to outgrow. That being deeply affected by someone is a risk you shouldn't take. That relying on others introduces weakness into your life. And the more consistent you are with that thinking, the more stable you appear. You don't get shaken easily. You don't depend on unpredictable things. You don't lose yourself in other people. All of that looks like maturity from a distance. But if you stay with it long enough, another layer starts to appear underneath. It becomes harder to let people in, even when you want to. Not because you're incapable, but because you've built a habit of holding back. You've trained yourself to process things internally, to resolve things on your own, to keep your center untouched. And that habit doesn't just turn off when it's no longer useful. It stays. So even in moments where connection would actually make your life deeper, you hesitate. You stay slightly guarded. You choose control over openness, even when openness is what you need. And over time, that creates a kind of distance that is difficult to name but easy to feel. This is where Nietzsche's idea begins to show its limitation. He understood that people can lose themselves in others. He understood that blindly following values or seeking constant approval can make a person passive. But he didn't fully account for the opposite imbalance. What happens when a person becomes so focused on self-creation, on independence, on rising above influence, that they slowly detach from the very things that ground them. Because independence, when pushed too far, does not create freedom. It creates separation. And separation has its own cost. Not in an obvious way, not in a way that immediately disrupts your life, but in the way things start to feel slightly less meaningful. Conversations become more surface level because you don't fully enter them. Relationships remain stable, but not deep because you don't fully risk yourself in them. Even your own inner life can start to feel repetitive because you're always operating within the same controlled space. You become consistent, but not expansive. And that is a strange place to be, because on paper, everything looks right. You are strong. You are self-sufficient. You are not easily affected. But something about it feels limited, like you have optimized yourself into a smaller version of what you could be. This is the part people don't talk about when they praise strength in this way. They don't talk about how much of life depends on allowing yourself to be affected. Not overwhelmed, not controlled, but affected. Letting something matter enough that it changes you slightly. Letting another person reach a place in you that you cannot reach alone. Letting uncertainty exist without immediately trying to control it. These are not weaknesses. They are part of being fully engaged with life. And this is where the idea begins to turn back on itself. Because if your version of strength prevents you from doing these things, then it is not actually expanding your life. It is organizing it in a way that avoids certain risks, but also avoids certain depths. Nietzsche wanted people to become more than what they were given. That part is important. He wanted people to question, to break out of passive patterns, to take responsibility for their own values. But in pushing so hard in that direction, he created a path that, if followed without balance, leads people into a different kind of limitation. Not one imposed from the outside, but one created from within. And that is why this idea can quietly mess you up. Because it doesn't feel like a mistake. It feels like progress. It feels like you're becoming more solid, more defined, more in control. And all of that is true to a point. But beyond that point, the same qualities start to reduce something instead of building it. They reduce openness. They reduce connection. They reduce the unpredictable parts of life that often carry the most meaning. And without those, life becomes clearer, but also flatter. So the real issue is not that Nietzsche was entirely wrong. It's that he saw one side of the problem very clearly and didn't fully carry the other side with equal weight. He saw how people lose themselves, but he didn't fully protect against what happens when people try so hard not to lose themselves that they stop fully giving themselves at all. And somewhere in between those two extremes is where a more complete kind of strength exists. Not the kind that rejects dependence completely, and not the kind that collapses into it, but the kind that can move between both without losing its center. A strength that allows you to stand on your own, but also allows you to lean when it matters. A strength that can question itself, not just others. A strength that does not need to close itself off in order to remain stable. That kind of strength is harder to define and harder to maintain because it doesn't give you a clean identity. It doesn't let you say, I am above this or beyond that. It keeps you in a space where you're always adjusting, always aware, always slightly uncertain. But it is also more complete. And maybe that is the part Nietzsche didn't fully reach. Not because he wasn't deep enough, but because he pushed so far in one direction that the balance on the other side became less visible. And when people follow that direction without questioning it, they don't become stronger in the full sense. They become sharper in some ways, but smaller in others. And that is the trade most people don't realize they are making until much later.